Great. So thanks so much for the invitation. I don't mind running a sort of an informal presentation. So if you have questions along the way, just please ask them when you have them. And I have some set slides here, but if we jump around, that's also okay with me. So thanks again. My focus, as Nick indicated, is on the built environment. I worked for a number of years in moisture-related durability issues, and but 20 years ago or so, sort of changed my focus to wildfire, built environment issues. Learned a lot as a UC person, learned more as with IBHS because of that sweet lab they have in South Carolina. So anyway, let me see if I can advance this sucker. Here we go. So today, I just wanted to review how wildfire, what exposures buildings are subjected to, when threatened by wildfire, discuss general vulnerabilities of buildings or structures to wildfire, and then answer questions as you have them. So here we go. 3 basic exposures for wildfire. I think, these things, being in a fire safe council I'm talking to, these things are not necessarily new to you. Windblown embers, the left-hand picture shows an experiment from IBHS that I conducted several years ago on the vulnerability of decks to ignition via embers. And you can see here that embers has ignited this deck, directly, and not without help from anything else. The upper right-hand picture, direct in contact, so the fire is able to burn directly to the building, and then radiant heat. The lower right-hand picture from a fire in Eastern Tennessee several years ago that I did a small post-fire assessment on, and these were so-called homes. They're actually, fairly large 4 or 5 building structures hanging off of those Eastern Tennessee hills, igniting one another based on radiant heat from one ignited building being transferred to another. This is another figure just from a publication that I've worked on with a couple of other UC colleagues just about a year ago, describing the same thing. So I think the important thing here is to acknowledge or to understand that embers can fly over any defensible space that a typical homeowner has control over and ignite things on, near, or in the house. And then the radiant heat and the direct flame contact are just sort of shown in a similar way. So the upper right-hand picture, an outbuilding, burning and breaking glass in a window, and the fire getting into the house in that way. And then the lower right-hand picture, the fire being able to burn directly to the home. Embers are really important. I think that's sort of clear to most, but these are examples of why, just pictorially how they are. The left-hand picture from the Angora fire, 2007, South Lake Tahoe, a lot of green stuff around this destroyed home. And then the Tubbs fire, Kmart store on the right, those 2 pictures on the right, destroyed inside, pretty great cladding system there. That Dollar Tree store is, thankful for the siding that the Kmart store had, because radiant heat wasn't a problem. And the radiant heat, or the heat went up, so to speak, and not out. But the upper right-hand picture, shows the gutted inside of this. And big box stores are typically in a pretty large paved parking lot. Embers, again, had to sort of get to the building. It wasn't the fire that burned to this Kmart store. So embers are important because what they do directly, what they can do indirectly. So on the left, we have an example of a direct ember ignition scenario whereby embers ignited the fence without the help of anything else other than the materials used in the fence. The right-hand picture shows this. All these are from the IBHS Research Center located in Richburg, South Carolina. the right-hand picture shows examples of indirect ignition. So embers igniting mulch at the base of the wall, embers igniting debris and gutter. The left-hand gutter is a vinyl gutter, so it'll detach and fall to the ground pretty quickly, and it becomes what's on the ground problem. The metal gutter shown on the right, the gutter stays put, and so it's an edge of the roof problem that it becomes. But inevitably, indirect scenarios result in a flame contact and or radiant heat exposure. So they no longer are an direct ember thing. It's the flame or the radiant heat that will cause the damage, but the radiant heat exposure or the direct flame contact exposure resulted from ember ignitions. So that's the indirect scenario. We sort of talked about, this is that Eastern Tennessee fire again. It's not Chimney Tops 2, it was a year before, a smaller fire in a development in Sevier County, sort of close to Pigeon Forge. 50 plus structures were destroyed, several more were damaged. But you can see the left-hand picture, you can see in the home on the right in this left-hand picture, sort of fully engaged, and in this case, breaking glass in a window in that under eave area on the the gable end or the rake end of the building, allowing fire to enter. This right-hand picture is the same same home that you see on the left that is just starting, 10 minutes later or so, and it in effect is fully engaged at this point. So once once fire enters the building, there's just so many combustible things inside the building, regardless of what's on the outside. So, fire growth can happen pretty quickly. And when you have radiant heat and close home-to-home spacing, you can have a large number of homes that are destroyed via home-to-home. So it sort of stops being a wildland fire per se, and it becomes more of an urban fire. We saw this in Coffey Park and after the Tubbs fire. More recently, we saw this just earlier this year in the Marshall County fire, Marshall fire in Boulder County, Colorado. I was there with a few colleagues just about a couple of weeks ago. And this is just one example where we had, so you sort of see the small part of the homes that were destroyed. You probably recall that, upwards of 1,000 homes were lost in this most recent fire in Colorado. And you see that you have, where you have one home, you typically have many more. And so we looked specifically at this Emerson Lane, Eaton Circle area. This is the thing in the square, the red square. We had, one on Emerson Lane. This is that red circle at the top, one sort of fire to home ignition, and then down Emerson Lane, home-to-home ignitions via radiant heat or flame contact. We had sort of very large winds during that time. And then ember ignition of downwind homes on that Eaton Circle area. And then the green circle home is a damaged home. It just so happens that there was a wind shift and a die down in the wind along about that time that corresponded with first responders showing up. So a damage instead of a loss. And there is another, not shown here, but on the other side of those two red destroyed homes, there's another damaged home. And that was also a wind shift kind of a save, so to speak. We were able to talk to a number of homeowners, well, not a number, but a couple of homeowners that actually stayed, and that really informed some of the things that we understand about what happened here. But we have the same issue with regard to home-to-home fire spread once you have the initial ignition via, in this case, direct flame contact. This was a grass fire largely, in the wildland, and embers from grasses are kind of tiny, and so the spotting distance is rather short. And so for these kind of scenarios, you pretty much need fuel continuity to the structure or the home in this case. And once you have that initial ignition, given proximity in these developments, you can have home to home spread more easily. So, how do we, what are our options for mitigation? So I think it's pretty well understood that this thing that I call a coupled approach, where you address vegetation and other combustibles on the property and things you do to the home. And so it's this coupled approach are the things that will help ensure home survival or building survival. And this is an old picture that I've used for a long number of years, but I think it really describes why you need to address home and property kind of issues. You can imagine this home, a spot fire, the vegetation goes all the way to it, and so you can imagine fire being able to burn directly to the home. But if all the greenery that you see in this picture were gone, parcel sizes are typically not large enough that you can preclude embers getting to this home should a wildfire be in the area. Embers can, embers from non-grassy vegetation and embers from other structures that are burning can travel easily a quarter or plus miles and still have enough energy to ignite fine fuels or combustibles on, near, or in the home. So that's why you need to take this coupled approach. The home, regardless of what's happening in terms of vegetation and other combustibles on the property, still needs to be able to resist ember exposures. So this is I'm going to talk mostly about the built environment, but I think there is the need to talk a little bit about California and PRC 4291 and the defensible space kind of zones, and the addition of this new zone, this 0 to 5 foot, is called a number of things. Initially, this zone was proposed by Ed Smith and his Living with Fire group in Nevada in 1991.
Hey, jump on that. Are you on that Zoom right now?
Yeah.
Yeah, jump on that too.
Okay.
I'm just finishing the call real quick.
Okay. Yeah. No worries.
It's only supposed to be an hour.
Yeah. I'll catch up with you and
I
Jay.
sent you a couple emails. I got a couple of
Questions. Yeah, I got a couple.
Okay, thanks. It was called Zone A back in the day, but it is this near the building, near the home zone. Nominally, it's 5 feet wide and includes under the footprint of any attached deck, as you see here. And the purpose of this zone is all related to embers. So again, embers are going to fly over anything that a typical homeowner has any control over, and so that zone needs to be such that it resists ember ignitions and it resists the ability or the resulting flame contact and radiant heat exposure that can occur. So this is going to be new. It's signed by the governor, and currently there's a small group that is proposing language in the Board of Forestry that will, determine what the language would be regarding what's allowed in this 0 to 5 zone 0 non-combustible zone. I think from the legislation called it the ember resistant zone. So we'll have some description of what's going to be allowed in it forthcoming. This is a good example of this zone. This is from the Waldo Canyon fire back in 2012, a good near home zone, including under the footprint of an attached deck on the same home, the left-hand pictures. That I think technically that under the deck zone should extend out beyond the footprint of the deck. So this is good, not perfect. I think the point is you can't really expect to have your own personal lumber yard under your deck and expect that deck to perform well, because flame impingement exposure to the underside of the deck is really a difficult exposure for any deck to resist. decks are tied to homes, you have a way to get out from your home to the deck, and those are typically vulnerable areas that will allow fire from a burning deck to get into the house. I think the thing that we need to not lose track of is that part and parcel with this horizontal non-combustible or ember resistant zone, whatever we're going to call it, you have to have this associated or coming along vertical zone at the base of the wall, so that embers that accumulate at the base of the wall won't have any combustible things to ignite on the wall. Embers will ignite at that, no, embers will accumulate at the intersection between the ground and the wall, vertical wall. So you need to have this vertical part to so that embers can't ignite any combustible materials that come directly to the ground. And even if you have non-combustible cladding, as we see in this left-hand picture, often combustible components in the wall assembly overhang the stem wall, the foundation, and so ignited bark mulch in this case will burn to the building and can ignite that sheathing that you see in this right-hand picture. So, even if you have non-combustible cladding, because of the way that the wall assembly typically is put together, and the fact that you often have this overhanging combustible component in California, because of seismic issues, we're going to have a sheathing product, and typically it's a wood-based sheathing product that provides that resistance to seismic, earthquake kind of exposures. So it's going to be there. So you can't really give a buy to a non-combustible cladding because of this assembly issue. This is a picture from the Marshall fire, just the one we just talked about. It was a good example provided a good example of why we need this zone. In this case, this tree that was about 6 feet tall, ignited, and even though this was a stucco-clad building, it had a combustible soffit material, and you can see on the right-hand picture that it burned through at that joint between the vertical wall and the soffit and into the attic. And this home was pretty much destroyed inside. The cladding, it's another thing where you have a non-combustible cladding and it sort of stands up after the inside is actually gutted. So a good example of that. And this is, so we're going to sort of move on, talk more about the home. I think this is the back page of a publication that I was involved with, again in 2001. And I think when we talk about the built environment, we need to sort of talk about where the home is sort of in the context. So is it in a neighborhood? Is it on a large parcel and the neighboring homes are far away? Is it on a steep slope? These things help inform what to do and sort of in what order. So we typically talk about the built environment in terms of components. So we're going to sort of do that here, walk through some of these components and what the vulnerabilities are and what we can do about them. So roof, vents, exterior wall, attachments like a deck, and then fencing. So we see here one red circle and a lot of yellow squares. The red circle, and I think the code says put a Class A roof on your home, and the Class A roof covering is going to be the only thing that's allowed in wildfire-prone areas. It used to be you could have a Class B if you're in a high fire hazard severity zone, and a Class C if you're in a moderate one. That's going away or has gone away. It's no matter if you're in a wildfire-prone area, you're going to have a Class A roof covering. But the Class A part, the Class A roof covering designation tells you about the performance of the roof in that red circle area. So it tells you the performance of the roof away from other things. And I would argue that on this house, the vulnerable parts would be, say, where the roof meets the dormer, the siding on the dormer, and it could be the siding that's the vulnerable part of this roof. And similarly, where the roof meets a skylight, where the roof meets a gutter, these are the places that can be vulnerable, that the fire rating of the roof covering tells you nothing about. And so you need to know these things and be able to address them to really have a roof covering that is less vulnerable to wildfire exposures. So here's just some examples. On the left and right, we have a non-combustible roof coverings that are clearly Class A, but the vulnerability of them are at the ridge on the right, on the left, and at the eave on the right. And they are vulnerable because long before the fire comes, debris has blown through these openings and sort of lodged themselves and accumulating in these under the roof covering areas. And during a wildland fire, then embers will go there too and ignite those fine fuels, and then you'll have a flaming exposure to the combustible components in that under roof area, the roof sheathing, for example. So code is changing here for new construction. Of course, most of us already live somewhere. So if we've already lived somewhere, then we could have this vulnerability built in and the code won't force anything. So there are sort of called bird stopping or enclosure of these openings, and we see that on the right-hand picture. We don't see it on the left-hand picture. The right-hand picture I took a number of years ago after a fire in Malibu, and this was a homeowner DIY job where he just used a mortar mix to plug those openings in the tile roof. And I just happened to walk by before he finished the job, so I'm fairly confident that everything is blocked here, but it gives you an idea of what you need to do in terms of blocking these entry points for debris, for rodents and nests that might come along and during a wildfire embers. We've sort of talked about this already, but there you do have gutter cover devices now that are available to minimize the accumulation of debris in gutters, so you don't have the left-hand picture thing happening. The right-hand picture is a combustible gutter cover device, and it's just kind of silly to use that because you have debris accumulating on that gutter cover device. That'll then be ignited by embers, and it ignites the combustible gutter cover, which is a plastic thing. And it's just important to remember that the edge of a Class A roof covering isn't the Class A roof covering. It is typically a wood fascia and wood sheathing for the roof sheathing. So the fire rating of the roof covering doesn't tell you about the vulnerability of that edge. So one thing you can do in these situations is to have a gutter that has an integrated drip edge, so it just slips under the roof covering in this case, or you can add a drip edge, a metal drip edge. It's a pretty inexpensive fix, but a very effective strategy to help reduce the vulnerability of this edge of roof area to these kind of things. You can also guidance would tell you to use a non-combustible gutter cover device if you're going to go that route. House on the left, you have a shingle cladding on the split level part on the left, and vegetative debris, so pine needles sort of accumulating at that roof to wall. That's what I would argue, that the vulnerability of this roof isn't the Class A roof covering. It is the cladding, the shingle siding there. That would be the vulnerability that you need to address. So here you can see on the right, this is a demonstration, so to speak, at the IBHS facility back in 2011 or 12. How easy it is for embers to ignite that debris that does accumulate. In the picture on the right, you see that it's the siding that is the vulnerable part, but also that under eave area on that dormer bump out. So on the left-hand picture, you have that same thing. You have the siding itself, but then you also have the under eave area that can be vulnerable. Replacing siding locally is typically a cheaper way to go than replacing siding globally. There has been some chat about using an intumescent paint, for example. Some research that we did a few years ago indicated that at least those that are on the market today don't really have a long enough service life to be used. When you have to be repainting every year, it's probably beyond what most people are going to be doing. So we need to look at other strategies. We can have apply flashing that goes higher up the wall on these situations, replacing locally. These are sort of options that are on the table. We see that here, the step flashing going higher up the wall to help protect against at that roof to wall kind of intersections. This flashing, you need to make sure that you do what I call let in. So that means you don't want the water to get behind the flashing, between the flashing and the wall in this case, because you'll have a rot problem before you have a fire problem likely. And this nominal 6 inches is really a nominal thing, because if you have a big loading of debris, it won't be enough either. So it has to be some maintenance involved in this to minimize the accumulation of debris on the roof. So another vulnerable spot would be vents. Embers enter into vents and ignite debris in the attic or stuff we store in our attic spaces. So we sort of need to understand that. There are two under E vents are the inlet air vents typically, but during a wildland fire, the vent that the windward side vent, no matter where it is on the home, was nominally an inlet vent or nominally an outlet vent in terms of air. Wind blowing against the vent, it is an inlet vent, and so embers are going to be forced into those vents on the windward side of the building, regardless of where they happen to be on the building or on the roof. We've done some studies both for fire and for ember, and the soffitted vents, the soffitted enclosed eaves are much less vulnerable, or much more, get this right, they are less vulnerable to embers and flame compared to the open eave construction that we see on the right. So that should be the preferred one. Embers entering into the vent and the blocking on that open eave vents, just it's sort of a clear path in, less so on the soffitted eave vent you see on the left. So you should be preferring construction like you see on the left, avoiding what you see on the right, and a retrofit that would be good for fire and embers would be to box in or enclose those open eaves in existing buildings. There are a number of ember and flame resistant vents that are on the market today that are approved for use by the state fire marshal. And we see some of those that are available here. The upper left is Vulcan. The lower left is O'Hagan. It's strictly a through roof vent. The one in the middle is Brandguard, and the one on the far right is Embers Out. These are all manufactured in the state and available. The state used to allow finer mesh screening. Of course, the problem with finer mesh screening is that it's easier to gunk up. It clearly does a much better job of reducing the size of embers that can enter, unless, of course, the screen or the vent isn't maintained, as we see on the one on the left, where you have sort of openings. The code is changing now to only allow approved ember and fire resistant vents, not allowing this finer mesh screen option. Of course, if you have a home, you're not going to be forced to do that. And in those situations, finer mesh would be a better option, but it does provide a maintenance challenge to the homeowner potentially, because they need to be a little more aware that they can gunk up, and they won't do their moisture management function if air can't pass through. Another thing, though, would be useful is to have a conversation regarding what people store really close to the inlets of these vents, and to move it away if it's boxes boxes of this or stored magazines of that to make sure that inside the attic, you don't have these stored items close to the vent inlet areas. So the vent on the left is a ridge vent, and these kind of external baffle vents that are typically there for wind-driven rain, but they do a really good job of keeping embers out also. But they are plastic, and so the issue with plastic vents would be what we see on the right, where you have debris accumulation against them, embers igniting that debris, and then flame against the plastic vent. So I think plastic vents in this on the top of the roof area just isn't a good idea. You can find these kind of vents that are aluminum, and that would be a better option. They're just not as easy to find as the plastic ones. These are not approved in the state, so wouldn't be one that you could buy that would be compliant with Chapter 7A. So let's move on to siding. You can see here the ways that siding can be vulnerable. One is that it ignites and burns up the wall, impinging on things along the way, like windows and undereave area. And the other one is that it just burns through at a lap joint and gets into the stud cavity. The requirements for Chapter 7A is only addresses the right-hand picture, the fire penetration part, not the left-hand picture. And I think that's a limitation of the way that siding is approved in this state. And I'll get to I'll show you a picture and describe a little bit better in the next slide. But this is, you've seen the right-hand picture before in one of the earlier slides, and the left-hand picture is from the Cedar Fire 2003. I think the point here is that we sometimes put a lot of emphasis on non-combustible siding, and it's just, there are other things you need to worry about. Not that a good siding product isn't useful, but it isn't the only thing. And this gets to the that 80-20 rule that just doesn't work with wildfire. So good siding is good siding. Good siding is a good thing. But if you don't address the other sort of ember related issues, then this is what you're going to see. So and then this flame spread on the wall, this is a demonstration again of IBHS. So you can see on the right hand picture the ember exposure to the building. This, if you haven't heard of this lab, it's a wind tunnel. You can put a full-size building in, as you can see, and generate wind speeds of up to 100+ miles per hour. For wildfire experiments, we never used that kind of wind speed, but we went up to 60-70 miles per hour, depending on the experiment. And we have this capability to generate embers. And so the guts of those generators on the right-hand picture are below grade, so you can't really see, but it's like a fancy burner that you put debris, well, we put wood chips and wooden dowels into, burn them, and then you have a fan at the bottom of the burner, and it blows the embers up through those vertical ducts and then into the wind stream of the wind tunnel. So that's just sort of the background. But here we see, I think, the issue with not including or not considering flame spread on the wall. You see the ignition of mulch at the base of the wall with subsequent ignition of the siding, vertical and lateral flame spread to the window, to the under eave area on the gable end of the building, and to the gable end vent on the gable end of the building. And fire entered the attic through the vent and through that under eave area. This was done a number of times. Sometimes the glass in the window broke, sometimes not. But you had 3 ways that the fire could move into the building, in addition to fire penetrating through the cladding system itself. And and it entered into the attic space rather quickly, within minutes. And it, during the time that this experiment ran, that never penetrated the siding system itself. It was always in these other areas. So you need to make sure in these situations that the window and the vent and the undereave area are providing, the same kind of protection. And often our codes don't really think about the system effect, so how things interact with each other, and that's largely going to be a guidance thing for the near future anyway. Windows, frame, or glass. A lot of studies have shown that the glass is the most vulnerable part of the window. So dual pane for energy is we have that now. The code requires one pane of those two or multi-pane systems to be tempered. More than one pane tempered is always going to be better. The cost of tempering is going down, but having tempered glass in a window will be a more expensive window than having regular old anneal glass. Having two panes tempered will be more expensive than having one pane tempered. So you have to, from a minimum code perspective, you sort of have to want the enhanced protection. The one exception to being indifferent or not restricting frame is a hung vinyl window, and you can see on the left-hand picture that the part of the frame that I'm not holding deformed in these situations. That deformation in that interlock, that the horizontal interlock on that meeting rail in a hung window, so the one you can lift up or lift down or both, it'll deform and allow the IAGU unit to fall out at radiant heats far less than that required to break the glass. So this was a sort of an important study by Fred Maurer a number of years ago that really showed the importance of having what you see on the right. When you have a vinyl window, you want to make sure it has that metal reinforcement in that interlock area, the meeting rail area, and that results in a frame not deforming in the way that you see on the left, and so it becomes a glass thing again. Vinyl windows are much more easy to damage, but when you're talking about the performance in terms of glass being the most vulnerable part, it is a failure kind of thing. So fire gets into not just damaging the frame, but it gets into the interior space of the home. Screening is always good. It reduces the radiant heat exposure to the window, to the glass, and it minimizes entry of embers into the home should you leave your window open and a wildfire threatens. We always say one of your evacuation things should be to make sure all your windows are closed. This is a plastic clad fiberglass screen. I think it's pretty easy these days in California, at least, to find metal screening, which is a better option from every perspective. Radiant heat, reducing radiant heat to the glass, and having a longer life, so to speak, in keeping embers out. Once flames touch a plastic clad fiberglass screen, they're done, and that's what happened here. If you have a non-combustible zone in this near home zone, then that's less likely, and you can expect sort of good performance in keeping embers out, as long as until that screen fails. Let's see how much time we have here. We're doing still pretty good. Decks. So you see the left-hand picture is that experiment you saw earlier about ember ignition potential. The right-hand picture is the standard test method used to evaluate decking materials for use in California. And you see it is an under deck flame impingement experiment or test. So it says nothing particularly about how the deck performs to embers. So if you have a really good under deck non-combustible zone, all your deck needs to do is resist embers, and it should not see flames. And And I think it's based on some research, how the deck responds to embers is not necessarily the same way it responds to an underdeck flame impingement exposure. So there's a piece of data missing in terms of how decking complies in the state. Saw that one again. So where embers accumulate on the deck would be in the between deckboard gaps. That's what you see on the right-hand picture, over a joist. So they're going to swirl around on the deck, as you see on the left. And if they land in a gap where a joist does happen to be, it's just going to fall straight through to the bottom. And so that's another reason why you want to have this non-combustible zone under the deck, because it will see embers no matter what you've done in terms of the front of the deck. Whether you enclosed it or not, the under the deck area will still see embers coming through the deckboard gaps where the joists aren't. But where the ignition is going to occur is in that between deckboard gap on top of a joist. And when that happens, the picture on the left, you're going to have sort of a creeping fire. This is a redwood deck, a creeping fire that's going to burn to the building. And so it's going to be, and it's not a big fire, you can see that, until it becomes a big fire. And there's two ways that it become a big fire. One is that it gets to the home and there's some combustible things there, or it's able to break glass in a sliding glass door, for example, or ignite a door. That might be how you access the deck. And then, it can become a bigger fire. The other one is that other way that you see on the right is that it burns, through into the underdeck area, and underdeck fires are the ones that are going to be big, and you're going to have a major exposure to the siding, but it's going to be in the underdeck area. What we've found is that where you have more closer spaced joists, so you have a smaller cavity for heat to build up in, that's where you're likely going to have the bigger fire start. And so if you have a lot of ignitions on top of the deck and it burns into that underdeck area, that's going to be the scenario where you get a large underdeck fire. And if it can burn to the home, that's where you're going to get another pathway to get a rather large fire. There are things you can do. Let's see. Yeah, so the things you can do to sort of allow the fire to occur, so treat the deck somewhat sacrificially if you happen to have a wooden deck. And so to back it up a little bit, the sort of the moderate density decking products like redwood and cedar were far more vulnerable to ember ignitions than the higher density products, like every plastic composite is much higher density, or even Ipe, which is a high density tropical hardwood. These were much harder to ignite by an ember exposure, several times more difficult. So, higher density products are good from an ember exposure. And if you have this non-combustible underdeck area, then I think you are in a better shape. If you happen to have a redwood deck, then an more inexpensive path to reducing the vulnerability of your home would be to add this non-combustible zone right next to your home, similar to this non-combustible zone in this ember-resistant zone area. The fire would ignite by, the deck would ignite by embers. The fire could burn to the home, but it would reach or meet this non-combustible area, so stop. So you wouldn't be able to reach the home. And then, so you have this two things going here, or three things actually. The B part in the right-hand picture is a non-combustible deckboard or a metal grate. Either of these things would work. And where you remove that deckboard, you're going to add a metal flashing member to the top of the joist, and then you add this on the A part is adding the metal flashing to the vertically, and letting in, that term letting in, that's what you see at the top, where the top of the metal flashing, where it tucks in at a lap joint so the water can't get behind the flashing in front of the wood siding. So this is a strategy that would be cheaper than replacing your deck. Should you need to worry about embers, and if your home is threatened by wildfire, it will have to worry about them. There's been a lot of chat about deck enclosure. You know, it seems to me that we need to have more a more careful discussion about this and more definition about what we mean by enclosure. There's two ways to enclose a deck. It seems to me vertically that you see on the left and horizontally that you see on the right. If you have a deck board deck, enclosing horizontally makes no sense because your deck's gonna, because of fastener corrosion and decay, water that gets into that, passes through those deck board gaps and gets into that under deck area that's been horizontally enclosed, it's just very little way out. And so these other moisture related durability issues are the things that's going to happen. Enclosing vertically that we see on the left, you still need to ventilate for these same moisture issues. So with a vertical enclosure using mesh screen rather than a solid thing, you know, that's probably a better idea. But I think you need to just worry about the moisture related issues when you start talking about deck enclosures. And so we'll leave it at that. You don't want to be storing stuff under the deck, and you need to acknowledge, and you want to be able to minimize the chance that flames are going to impinge in the underdeck area, and that's really what these kind of solid enclosures are supposed to do. But if you do that, you need to worry about the moisture part. We're going to finish, I think, with fencing. This is what we're worried about, you know, ignition of the fence and flames spreading to the house that way. This can happen. This was that experiment again at IBHS. The propagation of the fire to the building is definitely enhanced when you have debris on the ground and you have a continuous fuel bed to the home. The fence will engage, but it's definitely easier with debris. But we saw this example again in the Marshall fire, where the fire did seem to move down the fence to the home into that attic space. Fire moving into the attic, and you can see fire. These are black spots along the wall. These are where soffit vents were, and fire coming out of them from the attic fire in this location and the location down the wall above that glass block wall. And that fire from this, the damage from this fire resulted in at least cracking the pane in windows and damage to the vinyl frame in the adjacent home that you see on the lower right-hand picture with the red arrow pointing. So fencing is an issue. The mitigation strategy is sort of straightforward. It's having a non-combustible section or part of the fence, where it connects to the house, rather straightforward. So we have that to rely on. A lot of people are interested in active strategies, sprinkler systems, gel systems. We can talk about that if you're interested. I think there's a lot that we don't know about exterior sprinkler systems. The best document I've seen is a PhD thesis from a guy in Australia. It's really a very comprehensive study. And this is a good summary, I think. The green words are things that we understand. The yellow is, we may know something about it, but not from the context of a house and wildfire. And then the red text, things we don't really understand. And based on my reading, I really enjoyed this study because I think it addresses all the issues in an appropriate way. And I think that the bottom line is that even though we have a lot of commercial vendors out there, not a lot, but we have several for exterior sprinkler systems, I think there's things we don't know. And I know IBHS is planning a study in 2022 this year. So, maybe we'll know more with that. Some of the more actionable things that are useful to know before you go down this route, like where best to put these sprinklers, what the droplet size should be, so what kind of nozzle should be using. We need to understand more what wind does. So this, the other contexts, we know a lot about agricultural type of big sprinklers that you see in the field and for agricultural uses, because wind dispersion is really a thing there. So so there is some information there. Just is it directly applicable to the home? We'll hopefully find out. And then finally, we've talked about physical damage. These are 2 homes in Colorado after the Marshall Fire that are sort of relatively minimal physical damage, but uninhabitable because of smoke damage. So just summarizing, I think when you remember direct Ember ignition scenarios, direct and indirect. We didn't really talk about this specifically, but if you need to resist Ember exposures, it's mostly a detail thing, having separation where embers accumulate, flashing, that kind of thing. Where a home needs to resist radiant heat or flame contact, it's just a different thing, and materials become just far more important. They're not as important as details when it comes to strictly embers. And then just remember this coupled approach. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions you might have. I think I'm gonna stop sharing so I can sort of see everybody.
Well, thank you,
Great.
Steve. That's an amazing report and study. Wow, very informative.
Yes,
Do they have
thank
any
you,
questions?
Steve. No, but I wanted to mention when you were showing that space around the base of a building that had like a 5-foot clearance, and you said they didn't know what they were going to call it yet. It occurred to me to use it like a film when they're filming a crew and they held up that Hollywood sign that says take 5 or take 10 or whatever. So I would call it take 5 to survive.
That's very clever. That's very sweet. Thanks for that.
You can use that if you'd like to.
Okay, you're not going to patent that before I can use it or
Nope.
trademark it or whatever?
Nope. It's all yours. Take
Take
5
5 to survive. Take 5.
and have the Hollywood I don't know. I was trying to look for what that sign is called when the crew is filming and they hold up that wooden sign and it's like take 5, take 10, take number whatever. I don't know what that thing is called. Just trying to find it.
I don't know either, but
Okay, doke.
thanks very much. Yeah. So
Hey, I'll chime in with just an observation and just to kind of reinforce what the doctor's talking about. So last year there was a fire up in the Big Sur area called the Dolan Fire, and it ended up burning down the Forest Service fire station at the top of Nacimiento Ferguson Road. Station's been there for a long time. There was a lot of human elements involved. The station captain and his crew were there. They were actually sleeping that night off shift. Fire advanced much quicker than anyone thought and actually impacted the station in the morning. And there was, of course, a reluctance to leave the station. Many of the overhead personnel that were involved, the division group supervisor, people that weren't necessarily emotionally connected to the fire station, had early on thought, hey, this is probably not the greatest place to be. There's a lot of vegetation, a lot of overstory, very forested. But essentially, they all got trapped there trying to defend the structure. And I just read the report yesterday. So what's really interesting is that you look at the pictures and similar to what we saw in Paradise, there's actually quite a few tree canopy that didn't burn. So it wasn't like a massive crown fire that impacted them. And initially they were involved in structure protection activities, kind of keeping pace with it, spraying a lot of water around. Now, the buildings were not hardened at all. In fact, a lot of people are looking at this case and saying, wow, the Forest Service wasn't doing a very good job following what they preach in terms of defensible space. But essentially, everything began to deteriorate because the massive ember storm that hit them, along with some radiant heat impacts and flame impacts to some of the outbuildings, essentially started to catch outbuildings on fire. A shed, some fuel tanks, some vehicles caught on fire, the deck caught on fire of the fire station. And essentially they couldn't operate in that space after a certain point in time because the heat impacts from all of the built environment fire. It made it an untenable environment. And then they had nowhere to go because now they were surrounded by wildland fire beyond the defensible space area of the complex. And they all had to deploy shelters. There was burn injuries. They lost all the vehicles, all the buildings. It was pretty horrific. And they had to actually get out of their shelters and reposition because vehicles started to burn around them. They were actually getting protection from the fire based on the vehicle absorbing the heat. But once the vehicle caught on fire, then they had to get out of the way of that. So really illustrated, sort of in an ironic way, given that it was a Forest Service fire station, it illustrated how important this is. Firefighters no longer can provide structure protection once the buildings are on fire. We have to write it off and back out because the radiant heat from a structure fire is way too intense to be next to.
Right.
Our structural firefighters use massive amounts of water and full turnouts and respiratory protection when they're fighting a structure fire. Wildland firefighters are not dressed that way. And that's why you see that once the fire transitions into the urban environment and it goes house to house, it's very difficult for modern wildland fire suppression tactics to engage in that. And then you're just looking at, well, the weather changes, the wind stops, or you use massive aerial assault and try to outpace it, which is tough because aerial resources don't operate well in a wind environment either. So this is a great presentation. Really, thank you for that information. Everybody ask questions because this is the front line of science on this.
Yeah, don't be shy. Anybody have any questions?
Stephen, I have a question. As for foundation vents, we have the old 7x14 that have a gentle louver on them, but there's probably about a 1/4 inch space in those small louvers that would allow embers in there. What's the appropriate size on, if I modify those with metal screening, what should the size of that screen be?
So you probably have a 1/4 inch screen or so, that's really too coarse. So 1/8 of an inch is a good compromise between, not needing to clean it every other day and minimizing the size of embers that can enter. But embers passing through 1/8 of an inch mesh still have enough energy to ignite finer fuels. 1/16 of an inch would be where you want to be if you want to avoid that altogether. But if you don't want to have such an onerous maintenance issue, then use 1/8 of an inch mesh. But if you happen to be storing stuff in your crawl space, then make sure that that stuff is moved away from those inlet areas where the vents happen to be, like cardboard boxes and the like. Because embers that enter into an enclosed space, like an attic space or a crawl space, when they're outside, they are being driven by the wind. Once they enter into an enclosed space, the wind doesn't really carry in the same way. And so those embers inside of an enclosed space, they become more, they move hither and yon, not in a particularly defined way. And they need an accumulator in order to make them set down in a space in enough quantity to ignite something. And those accumulators are like the boxes of this and that you might stack next to the inlet. So you want the embers to be able just to scatter once they enter. And they don't land in enough quantity in any one location unless you help them do that by having these stacks of stuff near the inlet that would sort of force them to just lay right down right there. And that's when you're going to have accumulation in enough quantity to ignite.
Molly or Kelly, you guys have your hand raised. You have a question for Steve?
I do, Steve. Thank you. It's always good to hear from you and see you. I have a question about fences. Going back to some of the things we saw in Waldo Canyon and then what you were talking about with the Marshall Fire, Are you seeing in some of these areas that have extremely close setbacks, like let's say a distance of 10 feet between structures, and then there's a 5-foot wooden fence between the two structures? Are you seeing the fences primarily act as a wick to the structure, or are you seeing radiant heat, enough radiant heat generated from the fence to make an impact on the structure? So in other words, is 5 feet of non-combustible actually enough in some cases, or should the entire fence just always be non-combustible in the best case?
So I think a simple answer is the latter. But you know, we did do some experiments as I was walking out the door of IVHS as a retiree on this non-combustible zone, and we burned objects 5 feet from the building, from the test structure, and the goal or the objective of this particular study was to determine whether 5 feet was adequate, given things that might be there. And the things that we were considering being there were not a tool shed, a large tool shed. You know, they weren't like a year supply of firewood. They were vegetation and smaller things. And 5 feet was plenty. In almost every case, and the case where it wasn't plenty was at an exterior corner, because when wind blows against the building, there's a recirculation that happens, and so the flames tend to bend backwards, and that's why you need to have this continuity of fuel so that fire can burn to the building. So sort of a backing fire going to the building because of the way that wind blows around, or what wind does. But at an exterior corner, the wind just blows it into the building. And so 5 feet typically is enough, but I think it sort of depends on the fence itself, because fencing that's parallel to the building, I think those are the most dangerous fences, not the fence that, you know, you have to have sort of the right kind of things happening. You know, the non-combustible section is a conservative thing. If the fence is off the ground and you don't have debris there, the fence moving to the home, it's harder. So you have to have sort of fuel continuity in the fence itself. But a fence that's parallel, you know, those are the situations where you can have the entire fence engulfed. You know, so I think when you have these situations as you describe, having a wooden fence is not a good idea. So I think in those situations, you know, the fence is a good radiant shield until it's not, and a wooden fence just I can't count on it to be enough of one until it becomes a threat to the neighboring home that is that close.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Kelly, you had a question? Your hand's raised.
Sure, I do. Thanks, Paul. And thanks, Steve, for always good to see you as usual and listen to you chat. So I have three short questions, if that's okay. The first question is we recently did some post-fire work actually with Jack Cohen on one of our towns that burnt down this summer. And one of the things that we saw was stucco buildings where they seem to, as you mentioned, non-combustible walls, the building still burnt down, but it appeared that the stucco walls actually prevented radiant heat from extending horizontally to the neighboring wood-sided buildings, and in fact saved the wood. It appeared to save the wood-sided buildings. Have you seen that, you know, as a common theme?
I would say the answer is yes to that. And we see that Kmart store was exactly that. This goes way back to some of the studies that, were done for they were more related to Ember flight, but they were related to the studies around nuclear disasters in the, way back in the day. And I think it does have a lot of implications to wildfire, and that is fire, fire is contained until the roof goes or until the cladding goes, and then it starts to spread. So if the roof goes first, the heat goes up until it can go out. And having a non-combustible cladding system, if fire gets in, then it'll restrict lateral radiant heat exposure, except at windows, let's say, where that's likely to go. But yeah, so I think that made perfect sense to me, what you observed.
Thank you. My second question is, what are your thoughts on, do we have enough information? I've seen some assignment of probability of ignition based on components of the building. And this is a question that, I was asked recently on a call. What's your thoughts on, do we have enough information and research to start to assign probability of ignition based on building components? Or what's your thoughts on that?
I would say no.
Okay. Yeah.
I think I can talk on and on, but I think the short answer is no.
Okay, thank you. And my third question was, with the tile roofs, with the bird blocking and the solid bird blocking, the photo that you saw, my impression is that some of the tile roofs that I built or that I've seen are, they're sitting on strapping, and the tiling is part of the ventilation of the roofs. Do you feel that, should we be careful with that as far as when we're making recommendations to what folks should be? I've always used like steel wool as an example of a way to block where, it blocks embers but still allows some airflow, or is that not a concern?
You mean allowing steel wool?
Well, that's a poor recommendation, but also, completely blocking off an opening in the tile roofs.
Yes, that's a good point. Because you see a lot of situations where you have openings, so the enclosure, the bird stop or whatever you want to call it, isn't complete. And you can think of that in terms of Ember entry through a vent screen. It's that kind of a thing. But I think the other item is that once you are partially blocking, then you limit debris, and more importantly, I think you limit the ability of a bird or a rodent to get in there and build a nest. So, smaller embers may not be such an issue. I still think you want to block it as much as you can. I think it's really impractical to expect a full block, particularly with some of these commercial things. But I think there's steel wool. I think an option for blocking that hasn't really been evaluated too much is using a bat type mineral wool product that you sort of stuff in there. So it's a non-combustible product. It still allows some breathing to occur, for example.
Okay.
I think there are options, and I wouldn't worry about steel wool being used there. That at that point it becomes an aesthetic thing, or whatever, more than functional.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you. Let's see.
I don't know what Steve's time frame is. Any more questions for Steve?
There seems to be
question. I'm curious about Ember ignitions under solar panels, on roof solar panels. Is there, do you have information about that?
So this is an issue. So solar panels, plastic on the underside typically. It is all about debris accumulation in that under solar panel area. We had some installed on our home not long ago, and it's difficult to clean underneath them. So I live in Marin, so it's easy maybe if you have a hose and you squirt out the stuff. But when you're under water restrictions, spraying with a hose is something you want to be seen doing anyway. There has been some studies. One study in particular was a collaborative study between Underwriters Lab and an industry association called Solar ABCs, and they sort of mostly a code kind of an organization. They found that they used a flame impingement exposure only, and they found that the fire rating of the roof will be lowered. So it is a thing, but I think that the thing is just to minimize debris, because that's going to be the ember ignition of debris is going to be the thing. And also, though, we talked about that gutter and the debris in the gutter. If the solar array is sort of close to the edge of the roof, then you will have this flame impingement potential. So you want to avoid that. You can't just arbitrarily block off the under portions of the solar panel, because there are circulation things that need to occur. So I think this is an issue where it's acknowledged to be an issue, and myself and a couple of others are working on strategies for this, at least for a guidance perspective. So it's a good point. It is an issue right now. The easiest thing is to minimize opportunity for flames to get underneath there, and that is limiting debris, and then the gutter issue that we just talked about.
Thank you.
Ray, you had a question?
Yeah, Sheldon just put up a thing on chat asking about California live oak trees and how near they should be to homes. And I have some experience from the Hesacita fire. The fireman who sheltered in place in my home said that my oak trees were spraying out mist and helped. And when I came back to the home, the yard was absolutely a moonscape except for the oak trees. So I'm wondering what your thought is and your experience on others who have experienced this kind of thing.
So I don't have any experience with that. I think the problem with trees near buildings is if they're limbed up so that they're not going to ignite in the crown, it's just a debris accumulator source, and so it just is a maintenance issue for the homeowner to make sure that it doesn't. But I don't worry about trees that are well limbed up and don't have any lateral fuels underlying, except for the maintenance part in terms of leaf and needle drop, and where they can drop, and then the ease with which embers will ignite those things. So
That was a wonderful, Ray. I was typing up an answer to Sheldon when you started talking. Anyway, yeah. Quick question, if you don't mind, Steve. It occurred to me when you were talking about attics and vents and mesh sizes for screening. We have an old Adobe, 1920 Adobe house with a steel roof, awesome protection. But we also have attic fans on both sides of our attic vents that are maybe, I don't know, 1.5 feet by whatever a standard gable vent might be, with 16-inch metal screening. Anyway, the fans there are designed to pull the heat out of the house in the summertime. We can run front fan or back fan. So it never occurred to me, do you think during a fire, it would actually help to turn those attic fans on, because both of them would blow out away from the house? I just never thought of it.
I personally think that attic fans are going to depressurize your attic and make it easier. So I would not be turning them on.
Oh, to know. Thanks. Well, we have sprinklers on top of our steel roof. Trying to keep as protected as possible and lots of defensible space. Thanks so much again. Really
Thank you.
appreciate you.
Thanks.
Steve, are we keeping you?
I do have a meeting at 11.
Okay, well, you're already past that.
I got that. I
I
understand that.
appreciate it. Appreciate your extra time. So that's probably it then, right? We gotta let you go.
Yes, but I'm happy to, if you have particular questions, you can send me an email or we can set up another time to talk.
Awesome. We really appreciate you coming and giving this presentation.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation. I appreciate it, enjoyed it, and thanks for your questions. And again, you know how to find me. So thanks
Great.
again. All right.
Thank you.
Bye
Thank
now.
you.
Thanks,
Bye now.
Steve.
Steve.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks, Steve.
Well, I really appreciate all the new people coming to our meeting. We really don't have time for a roundtable. I'd love to meet some of these people. I know you guys really appreciate you coming to our meeting, and we look forward to you coming again. We have presentations every other month, and then we have a meeting every month. So if there's nothing else from the board, we good?
Hey, Paul, can we ask a quick question of the group in general?
Sure.
For the new folks that joined today, are there many of these people from North County? Lompoc, Sabata Canyon, Santa Maria?
Anybody from North County on the call today?
Okay.
Okay.
Matt
Anything else from
Marsh
the-
working from Buellton probably.
Okay, yeah, Matt, yes.
Yeah, there's a bunch of fire folks that are up in North County, and actually some of them live in North County. So, but yeah, they're all zooming in from their Solving Fire Prevention office.
Well, we
Okay.
appreciate them coming and being part of this conversation. Anything else from the board? Well, if not, Nick, you have anything?
No, I'm good. Thank you.
All right, well then, meeting adjourned, and our next meeting will be February 24th. Thank you, everybody.